It's not working that well, I don't think. I think the batteries are... It's a particular joy to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker for this session, who asked me not to use the term reverend in reference to him. He is the rector of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Clawson, Michigan. Harry Cook is a true, what we call Ohev Yisrael, someone who both understands and loves Jews. He is well known here in our movement, having participated in colloquia in the past. I remember 2 years ago having the opportunity to hear him and be inspired by what he had to say. In fact, he was chosen to contribute the biographical essay concerning Rabbi Wein as part of the Festschrift in Sherwin's honor, A Life of Courage, that was recently published. Harry is a journalist and author of 3 books, including Christianity Beyond Creeds. Our speaker is a kindred spirit with the members of our movement. The psychology literature concerning relations between individual members of majority and minority groups emphasizes each person's stage of identity of development and refers to the highest stage of identity development as synergistic. Perhaps they should have called it humanistic, which would be equally salient in describing the notion of someone who understands and accepts himself and also relates to other people on their merits, not with prejudice. There has certainly been a synergistic relationship, really a significant synergy between Harry Cook and the leaders of our movement that's been made possible by the unity which is enabled by our shared ideology. Because if you take away supernaturalism, our ideology and Harry's is really extremely similar. Let's welcome Harry Cook, who's going to share with us concerning how a Christian looks at anti-Semitism.
I need them to hold this. Hello? Okay.
It's a Jewish audience, they'll tell you what to do. It's true.
There's no shortage in my life of people who want to tell me what to do. So I feel very much at home. Any intelligent person from my background would and should feel somewhat intimidated by this distinguished panel arrayed behind me. But I'm still too shocked from an experience I had a week or 2 ago to be intimidated today. I am the pastor of a parish, and several weeks ago I presided at our annual children's liturgy for the Sunday school. And the reading appointed from the Gospels that day was one of those narratives that depicts Jesus of Nazareth appearing to have restored the sight of a blind person. And so that was a good opportunity for me to introduce, especially to new children and their parents, the more rational and humanist interpretation of such a text. So I decided to be clever and to do it interactively. And so I asked the children present if any of them knew any other instances in which Jesus was credited with fixing some disability or another. And right away, one kid piped up, the lame. I thought, well, pretty good. Little girl said, the leper. And then a boy farther back in the church said something, and I didn't quite get it, and I asked him to repeat it, and he did. I still didn't get it, so I cupped my ear and leaned out, and I said, say it again. He said, the deaf. I've dined out on that story a lot lately. My assignment today is to speak about, I don't know if we can say anti-Semitism anymore, but that's what it was originally. Talk about anti-Semitism, or call it what you want, from the Christian point of view. And I said, sure, I'd love to do that. And I began to think about it, and I thought it might be similar, in a way, to speaking about racism from Strom Thurmond's point of view. Seriously. Well, that's how intimidating the task is. But I confess that I was very happy to be invited once again to take part in this series of colloquia, which I believe to be one of the most significant contributions that your movement, or may I say our movement, has made to the conversation of civilized people. So I'm honored to be part of this exchange. And I wouldn't be here were it not for the fact of my wonderful friendship with Sherwin. I need to begin with a story. Okay, another story. As true as the one before. In 1945, my father moved our family from Detroit to a small village in northwestern Michigan, the kind of town where if you weren't born there, or your father wasn't born there, or your grandfather wasn't born there, you never really belonged, and I never really did in any significant way. Neither did my family, except for my youngest sister, who was actually born there in 1946, and who, by sheer dogged persistence, has managed at the age of 57 to become almost accepted. Though after 30 years in county government, she recently lost an election to county treasurer to a woman whose father and grandfather had been born there. It must have been my late father's appearance, and as I look at a 50-year-old photograph of him today, I suppose I can see what other people saw. But shortly after we arrived there, the buzz began to go around the village that the Cooks were the first Jewish family ever to live there. And so it was one Sunday morning when I took my place in the local Protestant church's Sunday school. The teacher, whose improbable name was Violet Amisager, asked me brightly why a Jew would want to go to church. And what was our real name anyway? I was about 8 years old. And the word Jew had not very much meaning for me, though I could remember my father having talked about what a cynical SOB FDR was for not intervening more effectively on behalf of the European Jews. I remembered that, but beyond that I was clueless. So I thought to myself that day, well, Cook, you're a Jew. And I looked around the room at the 8 or 10 other kids in that Sunday school class, and you know, well, we looked pretty much the same. Went to the same grade in school, played the same dumb pranks. So at our dinner table that Sunday afternoon, between mouthfuls, I asked why I had never been told that I was a Jew, and what was a Jew anyway. In the profound silence that ensued, my mother, by descent a prim, proper Scotswoman, laid down her fork and said, "Ask your father." And before he could answer, I said, "And what was our real name?" Turns out that our real name wasn't, in fact, Cook. Cook was an Ellis Island name given to my Italian Bavarian grandfather and grandmother. So I said, "Were they Jews?" And my father said, "No." And then he said, "But they might as well have been," and I didn't understand it at the time. Once I learned that I had come from immigrant stock and was helped to understand some what that meant and what it had meant to my grandparents and to my dad, I was given the first lesson in what my father called tolerance. We wouldn't use that term today, but he patiently explained to me the demographic history of America. And this is the best part. We still had a Detroit telephone directory. And after dinner, he sat me down and we leafed through the pages of that directory, which was bigger then than it is today. And he pointed out the polyglot nature of the listing of the names. And when we came to a series of the same last names, all ending in vowels, he pointed to one of them and said, that had been our name. And I asked him why it wasn't anymore. And thus ensued his own story and that of the family of our origin. Before the discussion was over, I had asked him what I should say to Violet Amasager, my Sunday school teacher, about the fact that I was not a Jew. And she said, what she doesn't know won't hurt her. And he said, what difference would it make anyway? He said, if you were, they'd have to teach a lot of things differently. Well, I don't know if Violet Amasager ever did really find out that I wasn't Jewish or that we weren't Jewish, but I hope the unanswered question made her crazy. She used to tell us that the antics that we carried on in Sunday school weren't very Christian things to do. And I thought at the time, why would that have applied to me if I were a Jew, right? And didn't we all think that Sunday school could be a very confusing place? All right. Enough stories. It's not possible for me to talk about this phenomenon known variously as anti-Semitism without acknowledging what I have hypothesized may be, if not its primary source, one of its primary sources. Ironically, what was originally a branch of first century Common Era Judaism that would later be called Christianity or institutionally the church. So this may be a minority report, ladies and gentlemen, but here goes. I need to say that I've spent a lot of the last 40 years engaged in ongoing research and analysis of the texts of that period, and the contexts too. Texts gathered into the document known oddly as the New Testament, and also the patristic texts that were not included in that book or collection of documents. Translation and analysis of those texts have been my passion, even as I, like so many other scholars, have to carry on day jobs, both as a journalist and then as a parish minister. Most of my published work, which is read by tens of people, never appeared in newspapers and journals for which I have written over these years, but it's the most important writing I've done. Some of it's available on the book table out there. So my working hypothesis for this lecture is that the phenomenon we are examining from a variety of angles this weekend had its beginnings in the historical developments that produced certain texts and contexts, and in turn rewrote history, shaped attitudes and prejudices, all under the escutcheon of orthodoxy. Small. It's safe to say that first century Judeans and to some extent Galileans lived under economic oppression, to be sure, and that oppression had plenty to do with the expansion of the Roman Empire. The last stand at Masada, which by some lights was a culmination, if not quite the end, of the Jewish-Roman wars, and was and is an indication of how much the religious tenacity of Jews had been trouble for the Roman occupation, even as it had been for the Seleucids some 150 years earlier. According to a scholar by the name of Cesare Colafamina, who is currently a visiting professor of Hebraic literature and history at the University of Calabria, I've been reading his research lately, documents, he says, indicate that the Emperor Titus forcibly relocated perhaps as many as 5,000 residents of Judea to an area about 180 miles southeast of Rome, now known as Venosa. And this relocation took place shortly after the siege and the destruction of the temple in 70 Common Era. Now, remember those 5,000 Judeans, because I'll come back to them in a little bit. Their deportation was typical of conquering powers and perhaps only reflects a general Roman disregard for people who were in the way, but may have paved the way for some aspects of what we are calling anti-Semitism. Yet, as we will see, that drastic removal was of a piece of things that happened from then on, well into the Constantinian era. Meanwhile, back to the first century in Judea and environs, the following series of events had been afoot. An itinerant wisdom teacher, whom later first century literature would call Yeshua, and an apocalyptic preacher, whom that same literature would call Johannes, had apparently developed roughly contemporary followings that were, for a while, perhaps competitive. And there is textual evidence suggesting that the former may have at first been a follower of the latter. Both seem to have appealed to the resentment of economic dislocation visited upon the populations of Judea and the lower Galilee by an urbanizing Roman government of occupation. Both Yeshua and Johannes fell or ran afoul of authorities. Johannes of one of the Herods, Yeshua of a Sadducee establishment, and perhaps also of the Roman proconsul in Judea. Johannes was known for his end-of-the-world approach to justice. Yeshua for his less aggressive ethical wisdom approach. Both evidently were executed for being flies in the ointment. Johannes first, Yeshua later. And around both of them formed traditions that for reasons remain unclear, at least to me. That of Yeshua won the day, or thus it is that history is construed, and so are the texts of it. Another part of my working hypothesis is that a collection of ethical wisdom sayings attributed, correctly or not, to this Yeshua person sustained a community of his followers for as much as a couple of decades, roughly from 35 to 70 Common Era. And such sayings may have included that riff on Hillel, for which Yeshua gets more credit than he deserves, something like, behave toward others as you would have them behave toward you. For more on this subject, I refer you to my 2001 book entitled 7 Sayings of Jesus, which just arrived at the book table within the hour. From the vantage of my hypothesis, I see what I call the communities of Yeshua Judaism, which were formed around those sayings, much as earlier communities of Israelites and Judeans may have formed around the crafting of the sayings that are gathered in Torah. In fact, I suspect that the Yeshua sayings were deliberately edited, arranged, and cast in the way they may be found, for instance, in a document called, quote, according to Matthew, unquote, so that they would remind people of similarly arranged passages in other scriptures. For example, from the 5th chapter of this thing called According to Matthew, quote, when Yeshua saw the crowds, he went up the mountain and began to speak, saying, how happy like the kings are the wretched, for theirs is the rule of heaven. How happy like the kings are those who are sad, for they will find strength, and so on and so on. That portion of According to Matthew continues as a series of sayings attributed to this Yeshua, again edited and arranged to make it appear that he had said them all at once, in one place to one audience, when it is more likely that the editor of this document, according to Matthew, doing his editing around 85 to 90 Common Era, gleaned the sayings, pulled them together like spare parts from several saying sources in the tradition. In some circles in different times, that portion of according to Matthew was known as the New Torah. Already, Yeshua Judaism was cutting the umbilical cord. This same Matthew, by the way, went on to show his true colors when he took a passage from an already existing document called According to Mark. And this passage in Mark tells of Judeans going about seeking testimony that might get this Yeshua in trouble with the authorities. Matthew took that passage and unaccountably added the adjective false ahead of the noun testimony, so that Judeans are, or sometimes referred to as Jews, are depicted as seeking false testimony against Yeshua. An early but clear case of what will develop into and become known as the A word. A word, anti-Semitism, all right? From now on, it's the A word, all right? Wake up. You there? Clear textual evidence in another first century, early second century document known as According to John reveals a growing and nasty split between what I call, for purposes of this thing, synagogue Judaism and Yeshua Judaism. In a contrived narrative about Yeshua encountering a Samaritan woman at a tribal well, Yeshua is made to announce that worship in Jerusalem is kaput, outmoded. Now, true followers will worship, quote, in spirit and in truth. Documents known as According to Mark and According to Luke, which, like the aforementioned According to Matthew, seem to have appeared in the last third of the first century. And these depict Yeshua's detractors variously as scribes or Pharisees or occasionally Sadducees, in other words, as various factions of Judaism as those writers saw it. But in According to John, Yeshua's detractors become enemies and are called with a clear curl of the lip, the Jews. And don't forget Rabbi Shalom's wonderful little riff on this morning's lecture. Jews may have made Barbie, but the Jews did not make Barbie. Very important distinction. Maybe one of the most important things that got said today so far. I mean it. I'm a newspaper man at heart, I guess, and when you say things pithily in a few words, it sometimes carries the day. Well, anyway, part of what was going on in that period, some of us who work with these texts think, is that the emerging movement was trying to tell its story using a vehicle already present in the cafeteria of religious imagery and language modeled on some of the Greek mystery religions that are replete with dying and rising sons of God and all that. Yeshua, being human, eventually died. It remained for the person or persons responsible for this thing called, according to Mark, the very first thing of its kind, to tell a story about the execution of Yeshua, in which he is depicted as a martyr and much, much more. According to Mark, appeared shortly after the destruction of the temple in 70 Common Era, and I believe in direct response to that event, putting me in yet another minority in my life. I was the treasurer of a woebegone organization called Southeastern Michigan Clergy for McGovern. That's how much of it. And you all love me here, but in the Episcopal Church, they call my church the Church of the Insurrection. So. Dr. Bauer actually laughed at that. I heard it behind me. All right. Yeshua Judaism may have been somewhat estranged from Temple Judaism prior to 70, but much as an adolescent in development becomes estranged from his or her family and as part of growing up becomes independent. Elsewhere and at much greater length, I try to make the case that the destruction of the temple was a colossal blow to Jews of every stripe and in every place. I suppose a case that's been made plenty by other people. Yeshua Judaism in particular was left with not much on which to hang its hat. The collected wisdom sayings then of Yeshua could no longer sustain the community absent that against which it thought it was rebelling. So, Saul of Tarsus, not my favorite person, and the later Yeshua Jew, the aforementioned John, who seemed so smitten with Hellenism, separately and at different times, they both began to invent a story along the lines of a Greek mystery religion in which Yeshua begins to be called Ho Christos, in Greek, the Anointed One, or guess what? Thank you. Now the abyss is yawning. Yeshua Judaism was evolving beyond its roots and tradition. Nothing wrong with that. It's all right. You can invent a new religion if you want. The formula often founded according to Matthew was, quote, "You have heard it said of old, but I say to you," so. Saul of Tarsus in his new incarnation was saying that living under the law, under Torah, is living in darkness. One must now live by the freeing charism of faith. Now, anyone who reads the Christian documents known as the Gospels, or what I call my according tos, sees quickly that most of the blame for the supposed lynching of Yeshua is laid at the feet of one or another of the Jewish factions, if not simply to the Jews themselves. Most scholars, E.P. Sanders is an exception, have discovered data that to their satisfaction makes it fairly clear that the power of execution rested almost completely with the Romans during the era in which Yeshua would have lived and died, if he lived or died. And if there is any crucifying done, it would have been done by the Romans. The further hypothesis, I'm coming to the point. The further hypothesis is that it would have been extremely risky during the last third of the first century when these Gospels were being written to accuse Rome of an unjust execution. So why not blame the other guys? So had the separation between Yeshua Judaism and synagogue Judaism, what was then, by then, becoming synagogue Judaism, going on. Next generation of the split off. In that, well, maybe 2 generations later, sometime later, 2nd century, a fellow with a curious name of Irenaeus. Not one of your favorite people, but you don't know it yet. He was known as the Bishop of Lyon. And in the late 2nd century, he came out strong for what he called orthodoxy. Ortho meaning right or straight, doxa meaning roughly opinion. You can't have your own opinion, you have to have the right opinion. For Irenaeus, it was a closely defined and monitored system of belief, in other words, from which no divergence could be allowed. And it was Irenaeus who championed the primacy of the Hellenistic gospel according to John at the expense of the more humanist, according to Mark's and according to Luke's, at the expense of free thinking. According to John, posits Yeshua as the unseen, unseeable God, yet in the flesh, period. Now, if you want to sit down and have a delightful couple of days reading a book, and somebody said it here yesterday, I thought of it first, but she's better known than I am, and I can prove it because I gave part of this paper some years ago. But anyway, a wonderful scholar of religion by the name of Elaine Pagels, or Pagels, who is a distinguished professor of religious studies at Princeton University, has published a new book called Beyond Belief. And in it, she makes a wonderful case for the very thing I'm saying by it. Of course, Irenaeus didn't write for the benefit of the Jews, but probably Such a proclamation as he was making could not have escaped Jewish attention, and one can imagine the negative reaction to it. Now, it's not known, or it's not known to me at least, if Jews actually publicly challenged Irenaeus, but judging from what Irenaeus later published in a tract reporting to refute heretics, it seems possible, for Irenaeus wrote these words, or these, at least this is my translation of those words. The Jews have departed from God, since they have not received his word, but they imagined that they could know the Father without the word, being ignorant of the God who spoke in human form to Abraham and then to Moses. And then, since Jews had failed to recognize Yeshua as, quote, the God who spoke in human form, Irenaeus goes on to say that God disinherited the Jews and stripped them of their right to be priests. They might continue to perform their priestly acts, but such acts would be invalid and worthless shams. Now, it was not yet apparent what all would issue from Irenaeus' writings, but he was the most visible and audible spokesperson in what by then was known as the Church in his day. His work is quoted to this day by the Church's most conservative theologians as definitive. Read some of Cardinal Ratzinger's books, and you'll find abundant footnotes to Irenaeus. What did happen was that within 150 years of Irenaeus' time, Yeshua Judaism, now known as the Church or Christianity, was in the idiom of our own time taken public. Now this is going to be, all these historians behind me are going to roll their eyes. This is a vast oversimplification, but nothing of what I'm going to say is untrue. There's just a lot more to say. When Constantine, 312, 313 Common Era, found himself still standing as the last of a quartet of contenders for the imperial crown, he looked around at his vast empire and saw it was hopelessly divided by language, culture, and religion. Competing brands of what by then was known as the Catholic or Universal Church were at ideological loggerheads. Constantine was evidently a very smart fellow. He decided to take his greatest liability, or maybe one of the greatest liabilities, religious conflict, and turn it into his greatest asset. So he issued that famous Edict of Toleration, in which the church was no longer to be persecuted, but at least tolerated. But old Constantine still had a problem. The church was enmeshed in civil war. There were branches and sects of it that did not accept this one-dimensional, ironclad Irenaeus thing, which insisted that Yeshua was God in the flesh and all that. There were factions who said, well, you know, the language of John is helpful, it's metaphorical, it's a place to begin, but let's have a little more useful and mature religion. Because the majority was this post-Irenaean party now led by Alexander of Alexandria and his faithful lieutenant Athanasius. Constantine did not apparently care one way or the other how the theological conflicts got resolved or reconciled. He just wanted peace. Get on with it. So he summoned the regional overseers or superintendents of the church to a riparian city then called Nicaea, on the site of which now is a village called Iznik at the east end of the Sea of Marmara. And the imperial charge to the overseers was to come to agreement on a creedal statement that would set straight, make orthodox, like your orthodontist straightens your teeth. Make it straight. Make the church's teaching straight. And the issue was whether Yeshua, now called Christos, was of the same substance of God or of a similar substance. Try to stay awake now. I know that's not an issue that really concerns you very much, but it was a big deal then. The post-Irenaean party, led by Athanasius, successfully championed the former, and so was promulgated the now infamous Nicene Creed, which I try to avoid saying, and when I can't help it, I cross my fingers behind my back and shut my eyes and grimace. And therein, Constantine, the recent convert, by the way, had his answer. All who did not believe that Yeshua was Christos, was God, were to be condemned. And guess who first felt the lash? That's the J word. By imperial edict, Jews were forbidden even to enter Jerusalem, save on the one day of their ritual mourning for their lost city. Jews who attempted to interfere with other Jews converting to Christianity were to be burned at the stake. And it remained for a fellow by the name of Theodosius, some 80 years later, to drop the other shoe by giving the church full imperial status and making it the one acceptable religious institution. Thus did Christian leaders of the time come to believe that they had successfully effected a supersession, not only by invalidating Judaism by fiat, but by demonizing its continuing adherents. It's little wonder then that Christian orthodoxy would perpetuate antisemitism throughout the Middle Ages. It would be found in, the formative works of Augustine, as we heard earlier, in the works of Aquinas, who is such a great hero to some people, and notoriously in the works of Martin Luther. And I think it was Rabbi Wein who mentioned the Fourth Lateran Council, which met in November of 1215, and Canons 78 and 79 stated that Jews, and by the way Muslims, must wear special apparel to distinguish them from Christians. Well, the archaeological record suggests, I'm going back to my 5,000 Judeans whom Titus supposedly brought to Italy, 70, 71, 72. The archaeological record suggests, according to Professor Colafamina, that between the 3rd and 7th centuries Common Era, those Jews lived in relative peace and concord with their non-Jewish neighbors. Something we've heard today and last night that happened in other places and other times. So assimilated were these Jews that most inscriptions on burial slabs, their burial slabs, are in Greek, mind you. And what of Hebrew script has been found, most of the characters appear to spell out Greek and Latin transliterations. According to Colafamina, the area around now what is now Vinoza was a prosperous center of trade, and its transplanted Jews played an important role in that business. Colafamina says that by the end of the 4th century, many of the settlements were dominated by Jews who became political and community leaders. Then came the 15th century, and they were shown the door at a time when orthodoxy and definition were reasserting themselves in the religio-politics and prejudices of Europe. Now I know all this is to some degree debatable, but I've tried to pack into a few minutes here what an adult time of inquiry and research has disclosed to me. It has made me, more than once, make me wish that my family had been the first Jewish family in Alden, Michigan. And by the way, we still would be. How am I doing on time here? When do I have to sit down?
You have another 15 minutes.
I'll take them. A Christian looks at anti-Semitism as the assigned topic of this lecture. Having now lived through its preparation and 3/4 of its delivery, I might call it A Christian Looks at Anti-Semitism and Throws Up. Makes me ill. I may be the only American movie watcher who could not get through Schindler's List. I said, I can't take it. Here's some other stuff I have to live down. During my undergraduate days, during the 1950s, I attended the lectures of a professor of history and political science, in fact, the chair of that department, in a pretty good college, with a Princeton PhD, who patiently explained how it was that the United States took so long to win the war against the Japanese in the 1940s. We could have dispensed with the imperial armies and navies of Japan in less than 2 years had not the Jewish, thank you, Jewish, what is this? It's like a Baptist church. Had not the Jewish influence around Franklin Roosevelt caused him to fight Europe's first war. Long before that, discredited. If this professor, the Allies had been content to let the Germans and the Russians fight it to the death, the U.S., France, and Britain could have triumphed in Europe without firing a shot. Right. Some of us actually said, well, what about the European Jews? As it was, we did not do nearly enough about them. The answer was that every war has its casualties, and the Europe of Beethoven and others had survived. What else really mattered? Well, that I did not turn my incredulity into outrage and lodge a protest against such academic garbage is something I have to live with. So, next building down campus. I was a double major in college, English and philosophy, and like a lot of young men of my generation, I became enamored of Thomas Stearns Eliot, and I learned the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by heart and recited it to anybody who would listen. Then I came to a poem with this line in it. My house is a decayed house, and the Jew squats on the windowsill. The owner spawned in some estaminet of Antwerp. Or this one. This or such was Bleistein's way, a saggy bending of the knees, and elbows with the palms turned out, Chicago Semite Viennese. The rats are under the piles, the Jew is underneath the lot. Well, I thought there's such a thing as poetic license. Maybe I had missed a point there somewhere. Then in a research project on Eliot, I came across a lecture that he had given at the University of Virginia in 1933, in which he said these words, quote, the population of any nation should be homogeneous. Where two or more cultures exist in the same place, they are likely either to be fiercely self-conscious or both to become adulterate. What is still more important is unity of religious background, and reasons of race and religion combine to make any large number of free-thinking Jews undesirable. I guess Eliot was hardwired for anti-Semitism because of the vast and long-term influence of the church upon the development of European culture and education. The church had for a millennium and a half a veritable stranglehold upon education. Now, the Reformation was able to shake off the administrative yoke of Rome, was able, with the assistance of Gutenberg, to help people read the sacred texts for themselves, but there's the adjective, sacred. They could read them, but the hermeneutic didn't get changed or reformed. And so texts believed to be sacred and therefore somehow beyond rational analysis became what was geschrieben. They became a malign pole star in the reckoning of who was who and what was what and who should be demonized. One of the arguments I've heard about anti-Semitism is that it has helped, albeit perversely, to maintain Jewish identity. If you love us, a person said to me, using the jarring term philo-Semitism, you'll love us to death as Jews. Dear me. I don't think that's the issue. The issue is for the non-Jewish Christian world, and I can only speak for that world, to take the cue, as I've been trying to get my part of the world to do for a long time. Take it, for example, from secular humanist Judaism to get real about the stories you're liable to read in the Bible and all that undemonstrable stuff called orthodoxy. And to construe text not as part of revealed religion, but as part of literary history. And the minute you apply that hermeneutic to such texts, a significant part of the cuckoo basis for anti-Semitism and a lot of other bad things disappears. In a recent lecture, it was given in the so-called William Massey Lectures on the History of American Civilization, very well-established tradition in Harvard University, perhaps even the law school, I'm not sure. But anyway, the novelist E.L. Doctorow sort of emerged from the fog of his contrived obscurity. If you read his novels, you know what I mean by that. He gave a series of brilliant presentations with not a bit of that verbal murkiness. In a lecture entitled Texts That Are Sacred and Texts That Are Not, he wrote or uttered these words. Those residual communal texts that have made us who we are were hard-won instructions for survival and discoveries of the intellect that were configured illustratively, sometimes in verse, so as to be transmittable by memory from person to person long before they became to be written. They gave counsel. They connected the present with the past. They bound the visible to the invisible. They distributed suffering so that it could be borne. Like the stories of today, they made no distinction between fact and fiction, between ordinary communication and heightened language. But they were not self-conscious literary acts. All the modes of language which we now distinguish according to the situation we're in had yet to be devised. Language was enchanted, and the very act of telling a story carried a presumption of truth. When Bacon and Galileo insisted on putting claims of knowledge to the test with observation and experiment, storytelling as the prime means of understanding the world was so reduced in authority that today it is only children who continue to believe that stories are, by the fact of their being told, true. Children, he said, and fundamentalists. So meanwhile, Yeshua, whoever he really might have been, was evidently an irascible Galilean Jew who distilled from the prophetic tradition a counter-cultural ethic, borrowing from Hillel, the great do unto others thing, and adding to it such disarming ideas as offering to walk twice the prescribed distance, carrying a Roman soldier's gear as a way of confounding the enemy, or turning one's right cheek to the tormentor who had already slept the left cheek as a way of maintaining one's dignity, etc., etc. Countercultural, subversive. Everything else said about him is a confection of self-serving theology, and I reject it. And again, I refer you to my book, 7 Sayings of Jesus, in which the hypothesis and rejection is treated in what I hope is a helpful way, though briefly. Well, I outright reject the notion that an end to antisemitism, or whatever you want to call it, will sound the death knell for Jewishness. And we were cautioned against saying anything about love, but I love the Jews and Jews. But look, a homogenization of cultures to one degree or another became inevitable in a world whose long ago inhabitants carved dugout canoes from fallen trees and paddled over the horizon. Ever since such craft put out from far shores, in the long dim past of human history, people and their cultures have changed and have been changed by social and economic intercourse and by intermarriage and all the other things that happen to human beings. Or look at it this way. Had my father and his people remained in that Italian neighborhood of Detroit, I can't even tell you what they called it because it's kind of crude. It had to do with the streetcar that went around. I'll tell you what, Cacalupo they called it. That was it. They'd remained there and remained isolated, and had he, like others, or had he and others like him married their own people and kept their own customs and remained separate from the world, where would you get veal piccata or eggplant parmigiana tonight? What kind of a world would that be? Meanwhile, I would be so much the poorer for never having been invited into the home of very dear friends to share the Seder. I would be so much the poorer not knowing that those same friends had planted trees in Israel to honor the births of my daughter Sarah and my son Max. And my conversation would be flatter and less interesting than it already is if I could not throw in an occasional Yiddishism. You know better than I that sometimes only Yiddish can carry the day. I mean, sometimes there's no word in any language quite like meshugana to say what needs to be said. Well, I admire you. I love you. I love the culture of American Judaism, its realism, its materialism. I embrace the American diaspora. For one reason, because its population is dealt so magnificently with the double whammy of being immigrants and Jews in an often unforgiving culture. One more story. I cherish the memory of my late friend John Mames, who was a dentist. Maybe some of you knew him. He discovered me when I was the religion editor of the Free Press and decided to give me a lesson. So I was invited to their home one evening. It was getting on toward Yom HaShoah. And Dr. Mames decided that I should learn firsthand about the Holocaust and thought it might help me to meet and talk with several death camp survivors. So I thought it was a good idea when I took his call, but then I went there, and there they were, with the numbers still. So I listened to men and women who had looked into the baleful eyes of Mengele, who had watched and heard their loved ones go to the gas chambers and later to the ovens, but who had themselves somehow survived. These men and these women talked to me about how it had been and how it had been since. I left the newspaper business shortly after that and, as we say in Protestantism, took a pulpit in a smallish, out-of-the-way place, doing my part since in undoing what generations of Christians had done by way of perpetuating the malign interpretation of so-called sacred texts that, among other things, many other things, but among them demonized Jews. As absurd as it may sound, given my biographical data and the introduction this afternoon, I'm not really a Christian in the usual sense of the word. And despite Violet Emasager's suspicions, I'm also not a Jew. I'm a heretic. Of course, these gentlemen all know what the word heretic means. It doesn't mean what you think it means. It means one who chooses. Heresy is a choice, and it's always been the choice to depart and reject a majoritarian view and approach to things. So, most days in this enterprise, I feel like Sisyphus pushing that stone up the hill. You can call me a heretic or even a philo-Semite, but I'm going to continue to push that stone up the hill as far as I can, for as long as I can. Thank you.